They told the crew the truth in one hard sentence. Yamato would sail on fuel for a one-way trip. The 7th of April, 1945, cold spray over the bow. Okinawa dead ahead, engines beating like a giant heart that was already failing. On a nearby destroyer, Captain Taimichi Hara listened to the briefing and felt what numbers mean in a sailor's stomach. Tankers gone, stockpiles thin, an empire running on fumes. American submarines had been slashing the lanes from Balikpapan and Palembang all the way to the inland sea. Mines from B-29 seconds now laced the straits that used to be safe. The fleet could not drink. Hara smelled raw fuel on the wind and knew it was the last sip for a giant. Hellcats and Avengers climbed, dived, and struck. American carriers arrived because American subs had already made the ocean empty. Torpedoes hit, bombs walked the decks, and a column of smoke shot up like a black pine into the sky. Hara later remembered it clearly, a tower rising 2,000 meters, then folding into the sea. A young sailor grabbed drifting timber. Hara told him, "Hold on tight." That human moment lives inside the larger arithmetic. The revelation is simple and brutal. A small American community, the Silent Service, had cut the throat of Japanese oil so completely that the world's largest battleship sailed to die on a fuel load that could not take her home. The enemy felt shock in a single phrase, one repeated in that wardroom: one-way fuel. America's strength showed as courage at sea, and brilliance ashore, labs fixing torpedoes, shipyards pouring hulls, and crews turning tools into victory. We ended with a scene no one expected at the start of the war, the pride of an empire beaten not just by bombs but by an American idea. Starve the fuel, and steel becomes scrap. Listen close to the sounds that made it real. A periscope motor humming, a talker calling bearing and range, the clack of the TDC as angles turn into truth. Feel the boat settle as ballast water shifts for a firing depth. Picture the radar scope. Green lines steady in rain, painting a convoy that once sailed in comfort and now sails in fear. See the pilot on lifeguard duty waving toward a submarine's deck as sailors haul him aboard, soaked and grinning because rescue is also part of American power. Understand the chain. Engineers in New London fix the weapon. Code breakers in Pearl push a contact. Skippers on the line make the call. This is how a free nation fights 1,000 minds focused, 1,000 hands building, 1,000 hearts willing to risk everything so a mission succeeds. Yamato's wake narrowed, then vanished. In that sudden quiet, the math spoke louder than any victory shout. An empire that cannot feed its furnaces or fuel its ships cannot fight. The Pacific saw a new kind of victory then, not just crushing an enemy fleet, but making that fleet impossible. A Balao-class submarine slid under black water like a knife being unsheathed. 70 men, one steel tube, one ocean to change. America trusted small teams to bend big maps, and the results shook an empire. The Silent Service was about 1.6% of the Navy, yet it destroyed roughly 4.78 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping and more than half of the enemy vessels lost in the war. That is a jaw-drop ratio, the kind of math that makes you sit up straight. Think of Commander Richard H. O'Kane and USS Tang. He drilled his crew until the periscope sweep felt like breathing, and the trim dive felt like prayer. He struck fast at convoys and then, on lifeguard duty, hauled 22 downed American airmen into his crowded boat. That is power with a heart. Steam lines screamed on a freighter as Tang's torpedoes ran true. Zigzags and smoke screens meant nothing when the hunter was already inside the pattern. Escorts learned the terrible lesson: battleships do not win wars if tankers never arrive. American radar, sonar, and the TDC fused angles and speed into a single number that meant fire. The chief of the boat touched the captain's elbow once, a silent yes, and the hull trembled as tubes belched steel and intent. The crew felt it in their bones, the way the boat settled when engines answered, the way the depth gauge ticked like a slow drum, the way silence after a hit felt like a sunrise. The enemy felt it in cancelled sailings and emergency routings that always seemed to end with white water and flame. A young seaman, a former machinist from Ohio, tucked a family photo behind the chart rack and wrote the day's kill with a stub pencil. He knew this was a job of inches and seconds, but also miles and months. He knew his hands, black with oil, were part of a map a continent wide. Above them, B-24 privateers reached across grey water to spot smoke. Behind them, code breakers filtered chatter into arrows on a board. All of it flowed to the tiny circle of light around a periscope eyepiece. That is how America fights, decentralized, disciplined, daring. The enemy's shock became habit. The moment a convoy realized the wolf was already among the sheep, a tanker staggered, tried to turn, and burned. A second took one in the bow and folded. The escorts charged a sound that moved like a ghost. The bridge to the next chapter is chalk on a wardroom board. One force, one strategy cut the oil first, and everything else dies slow. From there, even giants fall on schedule, and supply officers learn a new word that tastes like defeat. Empty, white spray, black smoke, silence. Hara floated on wreckage and watched Yamato's pillar climb into the clouds and break. Who could imagine this greatest battleship would be sunk within 2 hours, he wrote, and the sentence sounds like history signing its own name. The unseen cause began years earlier. Japanese destroyers, once kings of the night fight, were dragged into convoy duty and even used as transports because American submarines tore the merchant spine apart. The question every officer whispered was fuel. The answer was an American campaign that turned shipping lanes into hunting preserves. Early war torpedo duds nearly broke hearts, but U.S. candor fixed the Mark 14, added the Mark 18 electric, and unleashed skippers who trusted their math more than myth. S.J. radar let our boats see through weather. QC sonar let them hear through fear. The TDC made the numbers sing. A sonar man with cotton in his ears counted screws like a drummer, finding the beat, and called, calm as a clock, range closing. A helmsman nudged planes with 2 fingers and felt the bow answer like a living thing. On the surface, spray tasted of oil and salt. Below, coffee tasted of diesel and nerves. Hara kept a young sailor calm on the slick black water. Courage, we learn, is not owned by any one flag, but courage without fuel is a road to nowhere, and that was the road Japan had been pushed onto by men in American steel tubes. One giant battleship could not refill empty tanks, could not move raw ore, could not push kerosene up a pipeline that no longer existed. Factories dimmed, trains slowed, crews repainted the same railings because their ships could not sail. A destroyer captain who once hunted cruisers now hunted rumours of submarines, while his own bunkroom smelled of cold iron instead of hot oil. Americans can be proud without gloating. We learned faster, solved problems in the open, and turned data into doctrine. A nation of tinkerers became a fleet of teachers. Schoolhouse notes from New London and Pearl turned into patrol habits from Midway to the Luzon Strait. When giants vanish in minutes, it is because small American teams made the ocean empty long before the bombs fell. The bridge forward is simple and thrilling. Take one patrol Wahoo in the Yellow Sea and watch audacity turn into a system. We will see bearings become decisions, decisions become doctrine, and doctrine become the reason fuel drums go dry. The last sounds Hara remembered were human, a shouted order, a prayer, and the crack of a breaking mast. Those sounds matter because numbers are made of people. American crews were people too. Farm boys, machinists, radio men, who learned to turn midnight into a weapon. That belief, multiplied thousands of times, is how the greatest battleship in history met the hard mathematics of a nation that refused to quit. Dudley Mush Morton pushed USS Wahoo into the Yellow Sea, a chart of shoals and rumours of death. People said it was too shallow for submarines. He went anyway. Executive Officer Richard H. O'Kane stood beside him, counting seconds between bearings, inventing a new grammar of attack. Fast surface approaches, daylight shots, violent evasion. SJ radar whispered ranges. The torpedo data computer turned angles into certainty. Corrected Mark 14 seconds and quiet Mark 18 electrics finally did what engineers promised. A tanker took 2 hits, then burned like a floating refinery, sweet crude hanging heavy in the air. Morton wrote crisp patrol notes. O'Kane studied them like scripture. What began as audacity became doctrine, and doctrine spread fast. Boats once warned off no-go lanes now prowled them with American coolness. Inspect the math, accept the risk, deliver the blow. A sonar man in a wool watch cap counted propeller beats like a jazz drummer, then called target turning. The bridge watch braced as the captain ordered, stand by to fire. Tubes thunked, seconds stretched. Then the sea thumped back, orange blooming against a black horizon. The Japanese escorts charged, but their guesses chased a ghost. The submarine was already sliding under a layer, rigged for silent angles and speeds reshaped into escape. The human element here is a machinist's mate from Kansas, who fixed a balky exhaust valve with a file and bad coffee 5 minutes before battle stations. His hands kept the boat quiet enough to live. The enemy's shock arrived when routes stamped safe, filled with wakes that ended in flame. Escort commanders felt the leash tighten. Their destroyers were yanked from fleet battles to chase torpedo wakes and protect oil they could never fully guard. That is how a daring patrol becomes a national system. Laboratories fix weapons, schools teach tactics, shipyards deliver hulls, and crews aim the whole machine at the artery. From that day, the Yellow Sea felt smaller to the enemy and larger to us. Morton and O'Kane proved that nerve plus numbers beats reputation. The bridge to what comes next is science itself, because the tools that made Wahoo deadly were about to make every night a classroom where America wrote the lesson and the enemy paid the tuition. The smell of hot oil and battery acid mixed in the control room, and sweat ran in lines down the plainsman's neck. O'Kane murmured ranges like a teacher counting beats, and the quartermaster traced a pencil line that bent toward fate. In the wardroom after, Morton wrote one more line that every boat would understand. Aggression is protection. It meant that boldness, done with brains, saved lives and multiplied results, turning a small crew into a strategic weapon. That sentence walked from boat to boat like a prayer card, and the Yellow Sea never felt the same again. Night held low clouds like a ceiling over a black, breathing sea. A periscope eye skimmed the surface like a cat's whisker. Inside, red lights glowed on dials that turned luck into math. Radar laid down distance. Sonar told the truth through steel. The TDC fused it all into a firing solution a trained crew could trust with their lives. Even the enemy admitted it. Hara said the Allies' amazing development of scientific equipment, combined with rising air superiority, stripped Japanese destroyers of supremacy. That sentence is pure oxygen for Americans. We win because we build, argue, measure, and improve. A young electronics technician wiped salt from an SJ radome with the care of a jeweler. He knew a clear glass meant a convoy would die and a pilot would live. This chapter asks the problem plainly: how do you beat master seamanship? You change the rules with tools. Code breakers in Pearl cued boats to the right lanes. Aviators marked contacts with grease pencil grids. Skippers decided in seconds because a free nation trusted them to decide. On the plot, a pencil circled a tanker symbol, and a single word followed it priority. The sonar stack clicked like cicadas. The captain whispered, "Open outer doors." The crew could feel the future settle over the boat, as steady as ballast water. Up above, an escort flashed a searchlight across whitecaps and saw only rain. Down here, math and nerve turned night into an ally. 2 fish left, then 2 more. Time stretched thin as wire. A low, heavy thud came through the hull, and the control room breathed out as one. The enemy's shock was the night flipping sides. What their eyes once owned, our instruments now commanded. America's pride is not loud here. It is the calm voice on the sound-powered phone, the clean checklist, the tool rolled back into the canvas pouch. This is how a republic fights. With ideas that become instruments, and instruments that return sailors alive. The bridge forward is a new kind of thunder mines dropped from the sky to close the last arteries, while submarines bar the approaches. When the water itself can kill a ship on schedule, the story moves from daring to destiny. The QC sonar head hummed faintly, its dome greased and smooth from a maintenance check done at dusk. In the radio shack, an RM2 tucked a decrypted contact report under a clip and mouthed the grid square to himself, until it stuck. A lone coffee mug rattled once as the trim pumps shifted. The boat eased a foot deeper to hide beneath a cooler layer. American boats carried the authority forward, into the periscope shears, because our system believed trained people should act. When the hits rolled, the captain did not cheer. He trusted his people. They had trained for this hour since New London, and the machines had been made ready by hands in Groton and Mare Island and Portsmouth. A B-29 opened its bomb bay over the Shimonoseki Strait in 1945, but the payload was patient acoustic, magnetic, and pressure mines that waited like wolves in tall grass. The ocean swallowed them whole. Days later, fog and tide carried the first dull thumps into harbours that once felt safe. Operation Starvation had begun, a Navy air symphony that sealed the inland sea while submarines prowled the approaches. A Japanese freighter nosed forward, stopped, reversed, and tried again, then gave up. A chart full of blue turned into a field you could not cross. On the coast, an American prisoner heard the blasts like distant doors slamming and wrote, "Even the harbour is afraid." That sentence feels like weather changing. With convoys shredded and straits mined, Japan reassigned its few ships to carry food and salt instead of oil and ore. Industry bent to survival. Fuel-starved hulls became floating anti-aircraft batteries because they could no longer leave the pier. America's pride here is quiet and huge. The same country that built the B-29 also trained the sonarman, the minelayer, the ordnance officer who tuned the fuses, and the crew chief who signed the form with a pencil stained by grease. We were a nation where tools met trust. The impossible math gathered like thunderheads, tonnage lost, sorties halted, oil cut to nothing. The mines did not work alone. Submarines ghosted along the edges, calling out closures, marking patterns, and waiting for the desperate convoy that would try a new gap. When that convoy came, torpedoes met it at the exit. A pilot circling high could see the pattern the enemy could not. Steel arteries clamped at every joint. A harbour pilot in Moji tapped his cigarette, stared at a tide table, and finally shrugged. Nothing he knew could beat a weapon that waited and thought. The enemy's shock became policy-cancelled sailings, ration cards, factories idled for lack of fuel. The human cost cut both ways. American boats paid with 52 submarines lost, names now carved in stone. Yet the calculus held. A small force broke a great machine. The bridge to the next act is a ledger page that reads like a verdict. By early 1945, the pumps ran dry. The war had turned from movement to stillness, and stillness is a death sentence for an island empire. Crews coiled hoses and repainted rails for the third time in a month to keep their hands busy. A petty officer on a mined sweeper kept a diary in tiny script. One line captured the mood of a nation. We wait for water to decide. When the tally came due, the numbers were astonishing because the logic was simple. If no oil moves, nothing moves. And when nothing moves, even the bravest ship becomes a building tied to a pier, and a building cannot win a sea war. A clerk in Tokyo sharpened a pencil, opened a thick ledger, and started listing the day's losses. Names of ships, tonnage, last positions, not heard from. He turned the page and the list kept going because unseen hunters waited where sea lanes tightened. Far out in cold grey water, a Balao-class submarine slid at periscope depth, 70 Americans moving like one machine. It feels impossible that so few could hurt so much, yet the final tally hit like a gavel. U.S. submarines sank about 4,779,902 tons of Japanese merchant shipping, and more than half of all Japanese vessels lost in the war. 54.6%, written in a calm post-war hand. That number was not an accident. It was a system. Attack groups boxed convoys in. SJ radar painted reliable ranges in rain. The TDC fused angles and speed into a firing solution a calm skipper could trust. Mark 18 electrics and fixed Mark 14 seconds finally did what the design promised. The human thread runs through call signs and crew lists. O'Kane in Tang, Morton in Wahoo, Flucky in Barb carving the Asian coast and proving imagination plus engineering is a weapon. A torpedo man tapped a tube door twice for luck. Coffee tasted of diesel and nerve. Above, a panicked freighter threw up smoke and prayed to geometry. It did not matter. The approach came from inside the curtain of weather and wake. Escort skippers felt the change first. Their destroyers, once sharp swords of night combat, got yanked from fleet glory to guard tankers they still could not save. Zigzags lost meaning when the hunter started the fight already in your blind spot. The shock inside Tokyo was logistical, not just emotional. Cancelled sailings, ration tables, factories idled for lack of oil and ore, shipyards converting dead in the water hulls to floating anti-aircraft batteries because there was no fuel to steam. A prisoner on the coast watched a smoke pillar rise and whispered, "They're pulling the thread from a giant's coat." The bridge to the next chapter is quiet and devastating. A tiny arm of the Navy, about 1.5% of its people, became the most cost-effective instrument of strategic war in the Pacific. The proof sat in ink on a Japanese page that ran out of room before it ran out of losses. When the ledger closed, the math still echoed like depth charge patterns fading in a wake. 54.6. The sound of an empire's lifeline being measured, cut, and counted to the last ton. A refinery foreman in the home islands walked a steel catwalk and heard more echo than engine. Tanks that once gulped crude from Balikpapan and Palembang now smelled of rain and rust. The pipeline from the southern fields had been cut in two places at once, first by submarines killing tankers across 1,000 miles, then by B-29 minor layers closing the last safe straits. After the sea battles off Leyte in October 1944 and the struggle for Okinawa in 1945, the route to oil wasn't just dangerous, it was gone. Auditors later followed the numbers to a hard stop. By early 1945, oil imports to Japan had ceased. That is the day the pumps went dry. A dockman at Moji rolled a hose off a dead tanker and found only air. Gulls wheeled over quiet water that once sloshed with fuel. At a coastal camp, an American POW counted the pauses between dull blasts as Shimonoseki Mines claimed another hull and wrote, "Even the harbour is afraid." The shock soaked through every office with a wall map. The few ships still moving were reassigned to carry food and salt instead of oil and ore. The fleet became a row of static guns. Crews slept beside engines that could not turn. Destroyers that once raced into night fights idled at piers. Sailors repainting the same rails because work was all that remained. Americans can take pride in the quiet genius behind that stillness. Free engineers argued until torpedoes worked. Codebreakers queued boats onto tankers. Shipyards delivered stainless courage in hull form. Airmen seeded straits with patient weapons that waited and decided. It wasn't one miracle. It was 1,000 ordinary miracles tools meeting trust across a nation. The human note never left the ledger. A radio man in a submarine whispering a convoy grid. A machinist's mate filing a stubborn valve smooth. A pilot bobbing in a yellow raft waving at an approaching boat. The closing punch is the most revealing image of all. When Yamato sorted on one-way fuel in April 1945, it was not the first sign of defeat. It was the last undeniable proof that a small American community had starved an empire so completely that the world's largest battleship sailed like a candle with no wax left. A graduation photo at Mare Island showed a handful of fresh crews, white hats tilted, smiles tight with purpose. That sliver would be the Blade. The silent service made up roughly 1.6% of the Navy, yet it delivered the majority of Japan's shipping losses. The ratio still stuns. Pound for pound, no arm hit harder. The bill came due in blood. 52. American. Submarines lost. Names now engraved in stone, and in the memory of every sailor who ever dropped to periscope depth. Inside those boats, America's character showed. Decentralized command let skippers decide at the eyepiece. Candor fixed broken weapons mid-war. Teamwork fused radar, sonar, code breaking, and production into a kill web, and mercy survived the pressure. Commander Richard H. O'Kane taught his crew to strike fast and to save fast. While shredding convoys, Tang also pulled 22 downed U.S. airmen from hard water, proof that American power could lift as well as crush. Then fate clawed back. A circular running torpedo struck Tang. O'Kane and others escaped with the Momsen lung, were captured, and endured brutal stretches at Ofuna and Omori. He walked out of captivity into a nation already building the next generation, living testimony that courage and endurance come from the same well. The enemy learned a colder lesson. Even capturing our finest could not bend the curve. New boats slid from ways at Manitowoc, Portsmouth, and Mare Island. New crews took the tactics O'Kane and Morton wrote in salt and turned them into routine. A young plainsman from Iowa kept a photo behind the chart table and steered by touch, while depth charges pounded proof that ordinary Americans carried an extraordinary load. Up top, a convoy laid smoke. Down below, the sonar stack hummed. In between, American math decided. The bridge to the next chapter is America's quiet superpower. Innovation on tap. We admitted failure in the open, fixed it fast, fielded the fix, and pushed authority to the edge. That is how a small community bent an ocean. That is why the numbers read like myth and yet are true. The torpedo came back wrong too many times. Premature detonations. Deep running fish. War stories that felt like nightmares. America did something tyrannies rarely do in wartime. We admitted the fault, fixed the fault, and fielded the fix while the fight raged. Exploder settings were tested to destruction. Depth gear got corrected. Crews learned to trust their shots again. At the same time, radars improved from early sets to dependable SJ workhorses that read ranges through rain. Sonar stacks sharpened ears until a trained operator could count propeller blades like notes in a song. The TDC turned bearing, angle on the bow, and speed into a solution faster than a man could think it through. Intelligence fused in. Decrypted traffic, queued patrol boxes, search planes marked smoke, wolfpack tactics boxed convoys against coastlines and shoals. None of that works without the American habit of pushing decisions down. A skipper in a wet conning tower made calls that would swing economies, because the country trusted trained people with real authority. The human beat is a new London ordnance officer scrawling in a log. Prove it or pull it. That attitude saved lives. It also multiplied results. In weeks, not years, the weapon went from suspect to decisive. The enemy's shock can be dated. By mid-1943, even Japanese destroyer leaders admitted. Allied scientific equipment and air-sea teamwork took away their night-fighting edge. After that, courage alone could not fill a fuel tank or save a convoy. Boldness met a net of instruments, and the net won. Down in a control room, a chief whispered, "Outer doors open." A captain, steady as a surveyor, said, "Fire 1, fire 2. No drum roll, just competence. The hits came like muffled hammers. Water slammed bulkheads. Ears popped. The boat slid deeper and went silent. Above, searchlights chased ghosts. The bridge to the next chapter is thunder in the straits. We had learned to break routes with torpedoes. Now we would close them with mines that waited, listened, and judged. Innovation on tap became paralysis on schedule for the enemy. Night fog crawled over the Shimonoseki Strait like a curtain as a B-29 droned over beacons and dropped a line of patient killers. Magnetic, acoustic, pressure. They settled into lanes like wolves lying down. Operation Starvation had begun in full, and a waterway that once pulsed like an artery started to skip beats. Harbour pilots squinted at tide charts and found no courage in numbers. Minesweepers worked until their decks smelled of cordite and cold iron, and still the dull thumps came. Inland sea traffic bunched, stalled, and reversed. Submarines ghosted along the approaches, scouting patterns and waiting at the exit for the convoy that tried to break through. When that convoy came, American fish met it on the seam. A POW on the coast wrote, "Even the harbour is afraid," and you can almost hear the vibration in the pen stroke. The strategic effect cut deep. With outward lanes poisoned and ocean routes lethal, Japan shifted precious bottoms to hauling food and salt across short coastal legs. Furnace coal and oil feedstocks lost the fight for cargo space. Plants idled, locomotives sat cold. Warships became floating flak towers because fuel belonged to kitchens now. This is American power at its most mature. Navy brains, Air Force reach, factory precision, and field feedback rolling into a single strangling design. A lieutenant in a miner-laying group logged, "Area closed," without exclamation points. Our culture saves the fireworks for the 4th of July. The enemy's shock became resignation, cancelled sailings pinned to notice boards, workers sent home early, escort squadrons told to stand by for ships that never left the pier, and always the small human beats, a sonarman's cracked knuckles from long watches, a bombardier's pencil marks in a grease-smudged notebook, a deckhand's quiet prayer before he shoved another mine out on its cart. The bridge to the finale is the ledger itself. When you have choked the arteries and emptied the tanks, victory looks like still water. The last act will count the impossible math and explain why only a free, inventive, stubborn nation could make that stillness happen. Put the reckoning on one page. 54.6% of all Japanese vessels lost went to U.S. submarines. About 4.78 million tons of merchant shipping vanished under their torpedoes. 52 American boats paid in full. The silent service was only about 1.6% of Navy manpower. Yet it broke the back of an ocean empire. By early 1945, oil imports to the home islands had ceased. The last, loud proof was Yamato sailing on one-way fuel and dying under American air made possible by American sea denial. Those are the numbers. Here is the meaning. A free republic of tinkerers and teachers turned labs, shipyards, code rooms, cockpits and conning towers into one machine. We argued about failures in daylight and fixed them. We pushed authority to the edge and trusted, trained people with hard calls. We rescued our own, even while sinking the enemy. We combined radar, sonar, torpedoes, decrypts, mines, and production into a net that made movement itself impossible for an island nation. Our enemy was brave and skilled. Their destroyer captains could handle a ship blindfolded. None of it could refill a dry tank or haul ore through a mined strait. In the end, Japanese officers briefed crews with a phrase no mariner wants to hear: fuel for a one-way trip. That was the sound of American values, winning a culture that pairs courage with competence, compassion with force, and innovation with discipline. Picture the last images. A clerk closes a ledger that ran out of room before it ran out of losses. A POW hears only gulls and tide where freighters once groaned. A skipper in a quiet wardroom writes a last patrol note and slides it into a folder marked "Finished." The ocean is not empty, it is controlled. The greatest victories do not always explode. Sometimes they hum like a well-tuned motor run by citizens who believed that freedom works, even underwater, even at midnight, even when the only witnesses are the men who came home and the men who did not. That is how America starved a war machine and fed the future.